Christians and atheists really need to stop mocking each other. If you've ever watched a live debate or listened to a podcast where an atheist or a Christian is talking about the subject of the existence of God, it's very common to hear one or both of them mocking the other's worldview, saying things like, how absurd is it that people can believe X and Y? How bizarre is it that so many people can hold this ideology? And I don't like that for a number of reasons. It's generally just disrespectful. B, it really discourages people from thinking through these subjects for themselves, thinking through the existence of God and topics related to it, and researching and reading on the subject. And C, and this is where I want to spend most of the time, in this brief video, is it really neglects the complexity of this subject, and it neglects how we as humans are wired to build our worldviews. Hi, I'm David Mueller, and I help people think through subjects related to Christianity, atheism, and modern church culture. For starters, there is so much that needs to be learned in order to have an informed opinion on the existence of God. There's science, there's biology, there's philosophy, theoretical physics, archaeology, ancient history, and so much more that even if you believe getting to the conclusion on God's existence is simple, you also still have to admit that there are big questions that both Christians and atheists have to answer. For Christians, it's the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, religious diversity. If the Christian God is the one true God, why are there so many other religions in the world? For atheists, it is the fine-tuning of the universe. How is it that we seem to find ourselves in a universe that is finely tuned to support life? How do we get the first life form? And even if you believe the answer to these questions exists, you have to admit they're not simple answers. And both worldviews have to answer the question of why is there something rather than nothing? How is it that God could have existed from eternity past? Or for atheists, it's how could particles or these substances that the universe is made up of, how could those have all existed from eternity past? Why are either of those things here rather than there simply being nothing? And that's also kind of touches on a key point of many concepts seem foolish until you unpack them further. For atheists, we could say, in evolution, how is it that fish could have evolved into humans? That sounds absolutely absurd until you unpack the decades worth of research and literature on evolution, and then you realize it's a much more robust scientific theory. For Christians, you could say a classic, why is it that God would send himself to die on a cross in order to stop himself from sending people he created to a hell he created? On the surface, that sounds absurd until you unpack the centuries and the decades worth of theology and literature, and you realize it's a much more robust ideology surrounding that. And so from that perspective, it doesn't make sense to me for Christians and atheists to be mocking each other, because it's not simple, and it seems irresponsible to treat this subject as if it were simple. The other thing I want to call attention to in this short video is the fact that almost no one bases their worldview on a holistic and exhaustive examination of the evidence and the data. Instead, almost all of us are wired to base our worldview on our own interpretation of our personal experiences and observations, and then we sort of justify it with some sort of logic. Honestly, at the end of the day, that makes sense because we as humans are wired to take these sort of intellectual shortcuts. And for the most part, they often work quite well, but they don't work well for subjects that are incredibly complex and important. But These types of shortcuts are why you see most people who grew up in a Christian home tend to stay Christian throughout their life. People who grew up in an agnostic home tend to stay more agnostic for the rest of their life. It's also why you see people, if they become a Christian, they don't generally describe, hey, I read these 50 books and I came to the conclusion that Jesus is Lord. They typically start to describe experiences they had. They start to describe conversations they had with people and friends in a community that they stepped into. That's also why when people are leaving Christianity or leaving the church, they don't say, hey, I read these 50 books and I came to the conclusion that Jesus is not Lord. They typically describe experiences they had and things that disrupted the positive experiences. This is also why you generally see people who grew up in an atheist or agnostic home, or a non-religious house for that matter. That's why you generally see them remain agnostic or non-religious until perhaps they're an adult or later in life when they start to have more spiritual experiences. So to me, it doesn't seem appropriate or intellectually responsible to mock people for holding a worldview when we as a society have gravely neglected to teach people the importance of examining these things for themselves. And ultimately, as I mentioned before, the problem that mocking and treating these subjects as simple creates is that it discourages people from examining things for themselves. And the reason it's important to examine things, for oneself is it's been said a million times before, the big questions in life are too important to leave up to chance. And B, we no longer live in a world where ignorance is an option. We have more access to information and ideologies and, diversity of opinions than ever before. And so one day, someone that we all love, whether it's a child or a friend or a relative, a coworker, someone is going to ask you why you believe what you believe. And the surface level justifications aren't going to cut it anymore. So my encouragement to you is not to reroute your entire life so that you can become a subject matter expert in all of these different things. Instead, with whatever time you do have to dedicate to this over the coming months and years, is to start chipping away at things that you don't know enough about. Start reading books and podcasts, things that support your own worldview, and even more importantly, seeking out things that don't align with your current perspectives and worldview. Most of the refined and responsible opinions that we as humans can hold come from examining both sides of a debate. And ultimately, I'm confident that if you do that, you'll not only be a better friend, you'll be a better parent, a more informed voter for that matter, and just an all-around better person.